They said King John hadn't slept properly in weeks, not because of enemies, but because stopping terrified him more than moving ever could. As rain swallowed the roads and rivers erased the path behind him, the king ordered his court forward anyway, even as his body began to betray him in ways no crown could hide. Stay, and you'll discover why a medieval king believed slowing down meant losing everything, how fear drove his final decisions, and how his last journey quietly sealed his fate. If you enjoy this dark histories, leave a like and subscribe. Comment below where you're watching from. I'm genuinely curious to know where this story reached. In the final years of medieval England, when power rested uneasily on parchment promises and loyalty shifted like wet sand beneath armored boots, there lived a king whose authority echoed loudly in decrees, but quietly eroded behind the heavy stone walls meant to protect him. And while history remembers him as a ruler whose reign was marked by conflict, suspicion, and relentless pressure, few pause to imagine the lonely, unnerving descent that marked his final days. Days shaped not by heroic battle or dramatic betrayal, but by a slow unraveling that unfolded in the shadows of castles and along rain-soaked roads, where the weight of a crown became unbearable not because of rebellion alone, but because the body that carried it began to fail at the worst possible moment. And King John, once confident in his command, found himself trapped between political collapse and a physical weakness he could not command, a weakness that stripped away the illusion of control piece by piece. And as autumn settled over England with cold rains and swollen rivers, the king moved restlessly between fortresses, wary of enemies real and imagined, believing that remaining still invited danger. And so he traveled constantly, even when his strength faltered, even when his advisors urged caution. Because to John, stopping meant surrender, and surrender meant the end of everything he believed kingship represented. And yet the road itself seemed to conspire against him. For each journey drained him further, each night spent in unfamiliar halls left him more isolated, more suspicious, more aware that his body no longer obeyed him as it once had. And within the candlelit chambers where he sought rest, servants whispered quietly as the king's condition worsened, careful never to speak aloud what they observed. Because medieval courts understood that weakness at the top could fracture a kingdom faster than any invading force, and John understood this too, which is why he refused to slow his pace, even as discomfort grew into exhaustion, and exhaustion into something darker, something that could not be ignored. And those closest to him noticed the change not just in his appearance but in his decisions, which became sharper in tone yet less grounded in certainty, as though urgency had replaced strategy and fear had begun steering the crown, and all the while England itself stood on the edge of transformation, for the kingdom was already restless, nobles uneasy, alliances fragile, and documents drafted in haste had bound the king to promises he resented yet could not escape, and it was in this unstable climate that John's final journey began. A journey meant to assert authority, but which instead revealed how fragile authority truly was when stripped of strength, privacy, and time. And as his retinue moved across the landscape, passing marshes, estuaries, and flooded paths, the king's discomfort intensified, forcing frequent stops and delays that tested his patience and deepened his frustration. And in those pauses, when he sat alone with only the sound of wind pressing against tent walls or rain tapping on stone, the reality he feared most crept closer, that his body was betraying him at a moment when he could least afford vulnerability. And medieval medicine offered little comfort, relying on theories of imbalance and remedies that soothed symptoms without understanding their cause, and so the king endured treatments that promised relief but delivered uncertainty. Trusting physicians who spoke confidently while exchanging uneasy glances when they believed he wasn't watching, and though no one dared name the seriousness of his condition, the atmosphere surrounding him grew heavy, as if the court itself sensed an ending approaching. And John, ever perceptive to shifts in power, felt this weight even when no words were spoken, recognizing that authority depends as much on perception as on command, and perception was slipping away with every sign of weakness he could no longer conceal. And as the days passed, the king's world narrowed, reduced from the concerns of an entire realm to the immediate struggle of maintaining composure, dignity, and movement, and this narrowing was perhaps the most unsettling aspect of his decline. For a ruler accustomed to shaping nations found himself focused on endurance alone, measuring time not by strategy but by moments of relief and return. And through it all, England waited unknowingly, its future hanging in the balance while its king fought a private battle far removed from the grand narratives of conquest and law. And it was during this period, as rivers rose and roads vanished beneath waterlogged earth, that a critical decision was made, one that would define the final chapter of John's life. a decision driven by urgency rather than caution. And as the king pressed onward, unaware that the path ahead would cost him more than he could possibly recover, the crown he wore felt heavier than ever, not because of rebellion or resistance, but because the body beneath it was failing. And in that failure lay a lesson medieval rulers feared most: that power could command armies and bend laws, but it could not command the limits of flesh. And so the final days of King John moved quietly into motion, marked not by spectacle, but by a creeping inevitability that no decree could halt, no loyalty could reverse, and no crown could outrun. As the king's journey pressed onward through the damp heart of the countryside, the landscape itself seemed to resist him, with roads dissolving into mud and rivers swelling beyond their banks, forcing detours that lengthened each day and strained the fragile rhythm of his court. And with every delay, the sense of urgency deepened, for John believed motion was safety and stillness was surrender, and so he ordered his retinue forward even when the weather worsened and his strength waned. Convinced that a king who stopped invited challenge, and yet the strain of constant movement weighed heavily on him, draining whatever reserve he had left. And those who rode close noticed the way his posture stiffened, the way conversations grew shorter, the way he dismissed concerns with sharp words meant to conceal discomfort. And in the evenings, when the camp finally settled and torches flickered against the darkness, the king withdrew into himself, his world shrinking further as the body demanded attention he could no longer deny. And medieval understanding of illness offered explanations that felt reassuring but changed nothing, speaking of imbalance and excess, of conditions caused by environment rather than the fragile truth that sometimes the body simply fails. And physicians attempted to restore order through prescribed routines and careful observation, watching closely for signs that might suggest improvement, yet each morning brought only a fragile sense of continuation rather than recovery. And the king, who had once trusted no one easily, now found himself relying on attendants and advisors to maintain the illusion of command, an illusion he guarded fiercely, because he understood that the moment weakness became visible, authority would fracture, and fracture invited consequence. And this fear drove him onward even as his condition persisted, turning travel into endurance and leadership into performance. And beyond the campfires and tents, England itself waited, its nobles restless, its agreements fragile, its future uncertain. And though many did not yet know the extent of the king's struggle, they sensed instability in the way orders arrived inconsistently, in the way messengers carried conflicting instructions, and in the silence that followed questions, once answered quickly. And within the royal entourage, quiet calculations took place, unspoken but understood, as advisors considered what would happen if the king could no longer maintain the pace he demanded, for succession and continuity were concerns that hovered constantly in medieval courts, shaping loyalty and ambition alike. And while no one dared speak openly, the weight of that possibility settled into every decision, every exchange, every glance shared between those who understood the stakes, and as days blurred together, the king's focus narrowed to immediate survival. The effort required to remain present, to issue commands, to appear resolute even as exhaustion pressed in. And this narrowing of focus revealed a truth that history often overlooks, that power, when stripped of ceremony and distance, is deeply human and deeply vulnerable, dependent not only on loyalty, but on the fragile endurance of the one who holds it. And it was during this time that the king's movements grew more cautious, not by choice, but necessity, forcing longer pauses and quieter nights. And in these moments of stillness, surrounded by unfamiliar walls and the constant presence of attendants, John was left alone with his thoughts. And those thoughts returned again and again to the pressures that had defined his reign, to the promises made and resented, to the documents that bound his authority and the distrust that shadowed every alliance. And as the body faltered, the mind replayed these conflicts relentlessly, searching for certainty where none could be found. And the king's determination to continue traveling, to remain visible and commanding, revealed both his strength and his fear. Strength in refusing to yield, fear in knowing that yielding even briefly could unravel everything he had fought to preserve, and the irony of this struggle lay in its privacy. For while the kingdom braced for political change, the king faced a challenge that no strategy could resolve quietly, and the absence of spectacle made it more unsettling, transforming the final chapter of his reign into something deeply human rather than heroic. A reminder that even those crowned with authority remain subject to the same limitations as those they rule. And as autumn deepened and the air grew colder, the journey continued toward its critical point, with rivers that had once seemed manageable now standing as obstacles that demanded risky decisions. And it was here, at the edge of flooded paths and uncertain crossings, that the king would make choices shaped less by reason than by urgency. Choices that reflected the reality of his condition and the pressure he felt from every direction. And as the entourage approached these treacherous stretches, whispers spread quietly among attendants and guards, not of rebellion or invasion, but of concern, of doubt, of a growing awareness that the king's resolve might carry him forward, but his body was no longer keeping pace. And in this tension between will and endurance, the final days moved closer, unseen yet inevitable, setting the stage for a conclusion shaped not by grand confrontation, but by the relentless progression of time, terrain, and a weakening strength that no crown could command.